On a quiet farm in the countryside, Julia lived with her 9-year-old son, Alex. The move to the rural setting was a deliberate choice. For Alex, a nonverbal autistic boy, the bustling chaos of city life had always been overwhelming. The constant noise, the unfamiliar faces, the unpredictability, it all compounded his anxieties. Julia had hoped the open skies, rolling fields, and the slower pace of life would provide her son with a sanctuary, a space where he could feel safe and find some semblance of peace. The farm itself was modest but charming. A single-story house with peeling white paint stood at the center of the property, its wooden porch overlooking acres of green pastures and a dense tree line in the distance. The wind carried the scent of freshly turned soil and wildflowers, and the occasional moo of cows or chirp of crickets punctuated the otherwise serene silence. To Julia, it was an escape from the pressures of the outside world. To Alex, it was a world without the stimuli that so often overwhelmed him. Alex's days followed a predictable rhythm. He had always thrived on routine. Deviations often led to distress, manifesting in meltdowns that left both mother and son exhausted. Mornings began with the soft glow of sunlight streaming through the window of Alex's bedroom. Julia would wake him gently, careful not to startle him, and guide him through his morning routine. Alex didn't speak, but he communicated through gestures, facial expressions, and occasionally, an iPad loaded with a communication app. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Alex would sit in his favorite spot by the window, where he could watch the birds flitting around the feeder Julia had installed. Sometimes, a faint smile would tug at the corners of his mouth, a rare but precious sight for Julia. She always ensured his. One morning, as the golden light of dawn stretched across the quiet farm, Julia stepped onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The faint chill in the air hinted at the onset of autumn, and the trees lining the edge of the property were beginning to take on hues of orange and red. Her eyes scanned the familiar landscape, the soothing monotony of the fields providing her with a brief sense of calm. But as her gaze reached the far edge of the field, she froze. A large black dog with a stark white patch on its chest stood just beyond the property line, its form silhouetted against the rising sun. The dog's presence was startling. Stray animals were rare in their secluded area, and it wasn't uncommon for wild predators to wander near the farm. Julia's heart raced as she set her coffee on the porch railing. She glanced back into the house, where Alex was seated near the window in his wheelchair, focused intently on the small patch of dirt in front of him. His favorite stick was in hand, and he was methodically drawing shapes and patterns into the soft earth, his expression calm and distant. Julia's instincts told her to act quickly. She grabbed a broom leaning against the porch and hurried down the steps, her feet crunching against the gravel. But before she could cross the yard, she noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. The dog wasn't moving toward her. It wasn't growling or showing signs of aggression. Instead, it was slowly, almost cautiously, approaching Alex. "Alex!" Julia called out sharply, her voice tinged with fear. But he didn't respond. His world was consumed by the shapes he was tracing, oblivious to the presence of the massive animal now just a few yards away. Julia felt her chest tighten. The dog was enormous. Its thick coat gleamed in the morning light, and its sheer size made it a menacing sight. Julia quickened her pace, her knuckles white as she gripped the broom. "Get away from him," she shouted, trying to sound more confident than she felt. But the dog didn't flinch or retreat. Instead, it sat down a few feet from Alex, its head tilting slightly to the side as it watched the boy. It wasn't barking or baring its teeth. It was curious. Julia slowed her steps as she reached them, her heart pounding in her ears. Alex finally looked up, his wide, expressive eyes meeting hers briefly before darting back to the dog. Julia's breath caught as she saw something she hadn't expected. Alex wasn't afraid. In fact, his small hand reached out toward the dog, his fingers curling and uncurling in a gesture she recognized as his way of expressing interest. "Alex, no," Julia said firmly, kneeling beside him and placing a protective hand on his shoulder. She used the broom to gently nudge the dog away, but it didn't budge. Instead, it lowered its massive body to the ground, its nose resting on its paws as it continued to watch Alex. There was something disarming about its behavior, something almost gentle. But Julia couldn't take any chances. Her son was vulnerable, and the thought of him being hurt was unbearable. She grabbed Alex's wheelchair and began to pull him back toward the house, her movements jerky and hurried. Alex resisted, his hands still outstretched toward the dog. His hums of contentment grew louder, a sound Julia hadn't heard in weeks. It was as though the dog's presence had unlocked something in him, a rare moment of connection with the world around him. But Julia couldn't afford to let her guard down. "Go!" she shouted at the dog, her voice cracking with desperation. The animal finally stood, its body towering over her as it looked at her with dark, intelligent eyes. For a moment, Julia thought it might lunge at them. She braced herself, her pulse racing, but instead, the dog turned and trotted back toward the edge of the field. Julia exhaled shakily and hurried Alex inside, locking the door behind them. Her hands trembled as she wheeled him to the kitchen, where his favorite snacks were laid out on the table. Alex didn't seem to notice her distress. He was humming softly, his hand moving as though he were still drawing in the dirt. For the rest of the day, Julia couldn't shake the image of the dog from her mind. She found herself glancing out the window every few minutes, half expecting to see its dark shape lurking near the tree line. Her thoughts spiraled as she imagined the worst-case scenarios. What if it came back? What if it wasn't as harmless as it seemed? The farm was isolated, there was no one to call for help if things went wrong. That night, after Alex had fallen asleep, Julia sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. She felt defeated. The weight of protecting her son, of being his sole caretaker in an unpredictable world, was suffocating. The farm, which she had once thought of as their sanctuary, now felt vulnerable, its openness a liability rather than a blessing. The next morning, Julia woke to the sound of Alex's excited hums. It was a rare sound, one she hadn't heard in months. She hurried to his room, her heart lifting at the thought of him having a good day. But when she reached the window, her relief turned to dread. The black dog was back, sitting just outside the fence near the garden. This time, Alex was at the window, his small hand pressed against the glass as he watched the animal. Julia's first instinct was to grab the phone and call animal control, but a pang of guilt stopped her. The dog hadn't done anything overtly threatening. If anything, it seemed protective. But that didn't erase her fears. She couldn't let her guard down, not when Alex's safety was at stake. 4 days, the dog lingered near the property, its presence an unrelenting source of tension. Julia tried everything to shoo it away, throwing sticks, clapping her hands, even spraying it with water from the garden hose, but it always returned. Each time, it seemed drawn to Alex, who had taken to sitting by the window for hours, watching the dog with an intensity Julia couldn't understand. One afternoon, as Julia was hanging laundry on the line, she heard Alex's hums escalate into laughter, a sound so rare and unexpected that it made her drop the basket of clothes. She ran to the porch, her heart racing, and saw Alex sitting on the ground near the garden. The dog was next to him, its massive head resting on Alex's lap. Julia's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight. Alex was petting the dog, his small fingers tangling in its thick fur, his face lit up with a joy she hadn't seen in years. Julia's instincts screamed at her to intervene, to pull Alex away and banish the dog once and for all. But she hesitated. For the first time, her son looked happy. Truly happy. The sight of his laughter, of his uninhibited connection with the animal, was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Julia felt a lump rise in her throat as she realized the truth. The dog had given Alex something she couldn't, a bond, a sense of companionship that no amount of therapy or carefully structured routines had ever provided. But the questions lingered, gnawing at her like a persistent ache. Where had the dog come from? Why had it chosen their farm? And what did it mean for their fragile, carefully constructed life? Julia didn't have the answers. All she knew was that the black dog, with its white patch and its unwavering presence, had become an uninvited yet undeniable part of their story. And with it came a tension she couldn't ignore, a feeling that their peaceful isolation was no longer as safe as it once seemed. Blaze, as Alex would later call him, became a fixture on the farm, his large, imposing frame contrasting with his gentle demeanor. The dog's presence, which had initially filled Julia with dread, began to take on an air of inevitability. It was as though Blaze had always belonged there, a silent guardian drawn to the boy who sat tracing shapes in the dirt. That pivotal moment, when Alex first reached out and touched Blaze, played on repeat in Julia's mind. She had been frozen, her breath caught as she watched her son's small hand press against the dog's thick fur. Alex, who had never initiated contact with anyone, not even Julia, did it without hesitation. His fingers moved slowly, almost methodically, exploring the texture of Blaze's coat. A soft hum escaped his lips, rising and falling in a rhythm that Julia recognized as his expression of contentment. It was so rare, so heartbreakingly rare, that Julia didn't know whether to cry or call out to him. Blaze had stayed perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Alex with an unreadable intensity. There was no growl, no flinch, just quiet acceptance. And then Alex had done something that shattered every assumption Julia had about her son. He smiled. A small, fleeting smile, but it was there. Her heart clenched as she realized just how long it had been since she'd seen that expression on his face. In the days that followed, Blaze became Alex's constant companion. The dog would appear like clockwork every morning, settling down near Alex's wheelchair or following him as he explored the sensory garden. Julia had tried to keep Blaze away at first, waving him off with the broom or clapping her hands to scare him. But nothing worked. Blaze was undeterred, always returning with the same calm persistence. And Alex, for his part, was equally determined. He would will himself closer to the dog or crawl out of his chair to sit beside him, his small hands moving over Blaze's fur in a way that seemed almost therapeutic. Julia didn't know what to make of it. On one hand, she couldn't deny the positive effect Blaze was having on Alex. Her son, who had always been locked in his own world, was reaching out, literally and figuratively. But on the other hand, the situation filled her with a gnawing sense of inadequacy. It was a feeling she didn't want to acknowledge, let alone confront, but it was there, festering in the back of her mind. Why was it that a stray dog could do what she, as his mother, had struggled to achieve? Why did Alex seem to connect with Blaze in a way he never had with her? The tension in Julia's chest grew with every interaction she witnessed. She found herself oscillating between gratitude and resentment, between hope and despair. The farm, which had once been her refuge, now felt like a stage where her failures were laid bare. Each time she saw Alex smiling at Blaze or heard his soft hums of contentment, she couldn't help but feel a sting of humiliation. Was she not enough for her own son? One afternoon, as Julia watched from the kitchen window, she saw Alex lying in the grass with Blaze stretched out beside him. Alex's hand was buried in the dog's fur, his face serene. It was a scene that should have filled her with joy, but instead, it left her feeling hollow. She turned away from the window, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as she fought back tears. It wasn't Blaze's fault, she knew that. But the jealousy she felt, the sense of being replaced, was undeniable. The situation grew more complicated when the neighbors began to notice Blaze. One evening, as Julia was collecting eggs from the chicken coop, she saw Mrs. Anders from the farm down the road approaching with her 2 dogs. The elderly woman stopped at the edge of the fence, her gaze fixed on Blaze, who was lying near the porch. "That's a big dog you've got there," Mrs. Anders called out, her tone sharp. "He's been wandering onto our property too. Spooked my hens last week?" Julia forced a smile, wiping her hands on her jeans as she walked over. "He's not ours," she explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "He just showed up one day." Mrs. Anders raised an eyebrow. "You're letting a stray around your boy? That doesn't seem safe." Her words hit Julia like a slap. She opened her mouth to respond but found herself fumbling for an answer. Mrs. Anders shook her head, muttering something under her breath before walking away. Julia stood there, her cheeks burning with shame. She hated how quickly judgment came from others, how they always seemed to assume she was making the wrong choices. Didn't they see how hard she was trying? How much she sacrificed for Alex? But even as she thought this, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts. Was Mrs. Anders right? Was she being irresponsible by allowing Blaze to stay? The breaking point came a few weeks later. It was a cold, gray morning, and Alex was in the garden with Blaze, his hums carrying through the crisp air. Julia was inside, sorting through the stack of bills on the kitchen table, her shoulders tense. The financial strain of the farm was becoming unbearable. Therapy sessions, medical supplies, repairs to the house, it all added up, and her freelance writing wasn't enough to cover it. She felt the weight of it pressing down on her, suffocating her. A sharp knock at the door startled her. Julia opened it to find Mr. Clark, the neighbor from the next property over, standing on the porch with a shotgun slung over his shoulder. His face was grim. "That dog of yours has been chasing my sheep," he said without preamble. "If I see him on my land again, I won't hesitate to take care of it." Julia's stomach dropped. "He's not my dog," she said quickly, her voice shaking. He just showed up. But I'll make sure he stays off your property." Mr. Clark narrowed his eyes. "You better. A dog like that? It's trouble waiting to happen." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Julia standing there, her heart pounding. That night, as Alex slept, Julia sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. The house felt unbearably quiet, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Clark's words, or the fear in Mrs. Anders' eyes when she'd seen Blaze. The dog, despite his calm demeanor, was becoming a liability. But how could she send him away? How could she take away the one thing that brought Alex happiness? The questions swirled in her mind, relentless and unanswerable. She looked out the window, where Blaze was curled up on the porch, his dark silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. Julia felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name: guilt, sorrow, maybe even anger. She was trapped between two impossible choices: protect her son's newfound connection or shield him from the dangers the dog might bring. Blaze, for his part, remained silent and steadfast, a constant presence in their lives. But his calmness only added to Julia's turmoil. She couldn't shake the feeling that his arrival was just the beginning, that the peace she had worked so hard to create was on the verge of unraveling. Blaze became an inseparable part of Alex's life. Every morning, like clockwork, the dog would appear at the edge of the field, his large frame silhouetted against the morning mist. Julia no longer tried to chase him away. It had become clear that Blaze wasn't leaving, no matter how many times she shouted or waved her arms. More importantly, Alex's transformation was undeniable. Alex began venturing outside more often, his wheelchair bumping over the uneven dirt paths as he made his way toward Blaze. The once reclusive boy, who had spent most of his time indoors, now seemed drawn to the open spaces of the farm. He spent hours sitting in the grass with Blaze by his side, running his small hands over the dog's thick fur. His laughter, once a rare and precious sound, now filled the air regularly. Julia had to admit, grudgingly, that Blaze had brought something to Alex's life she never could. But with every smile and every laugh, Julia felt a growing knot of shame. She hated herself for feeling jealous of a dog, but the resentment gnawed at her. Alex had been hers to care for, hers to protect, hers to connect with. Yet it was Blaze who had unlocked a part of her son she'd been unable to reach. The humiliation of it left her sleepless most nights, staring at the ceiling as doubts consumed her. To the outside world, Blaze was still a problem. Neighbors complained about his presence, and Julia often felt the weight of their judgment. "That stray of yours is still roaming around," Mrs. Anders remarked one afternoon when they crossed paths in town. Her tone was sharp, her disapproval evident. "You ought to do something about it. Can't have a dog like that running wild." Julia flushed, her hands tightening on the grocery cart. "He's not ours," she muttered, but the words felt hollow even as she said them. Blaze might not technically belong to them, but it was clear he had chosen Alex. And Alex had chosen him. The comments from neighbors weren't the only source of tension. Julia's parents, who had never been particularly understanding of Alex's condition, made their opinions known during one of their rare phone calls. "A dog?" her mother had scoffed. "You can't even manage your own son, and now you're letting a stray run around? What if it bites him? What kind of mother takes that kind of risk?" Julia bit back tears as she ended the call. The humiliation of their words lingered long after the conversation ended, feeding the doubts that already plagued her. Was she a bad mother? Was Blaze a mistake, despite the joy he brought to Alex? Even Alex's therapist expressed concerns during their virtual sessions. "It's wonderful to see Alex so engaged," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "But you need to think about long-term safety. Stray animals can be unpredictable. Have you thought about rehoming the dog?" The suggestion sent a pang of guilt through Julia. Rehoming Blaze? She couldn't imagine what that would do to Alex. But the idea planted itself in her mind, growing into a persistent whisper that she couldn't ignore. One particularly cold morning, Julia found Alex outside before she'd even woken up. He was sitting in the middle of the field, his thin jacket doing little to shield him from the chill. Blaze was next to him, his large body pressed close to Alex's side as though shielding him from the cold. Alex was laughing, his head tilted back as he watched a flock of birds scatter across the sky. Julia's chest tightened at the sight. She was torn between anger and awe, anger that Alex had gone outside without her knowledge, and awe at the happiness that radiated from him. But as she approached, her anger won out. "Alex," she shouted, her voice sharp. "What are you doing out here? It's freezing." Alex didn't respond as usual, but his laughter died down. Blaze stood protectively as Julia reached them, his dark eyes watching her closely. Julia grabbed the handles of Alex's wheelchair and began wheeling him back toward the house, her movements jerky and frustrated. "You can't just run off like that," she muttered, though she knew Alex wouldn't answer. "What if you'd gotten sick? What if something had happened?" Alex's hands reached out toward Blaze, who followed them at a distance, his tail wagging slowly. Julia stopped and turned to glare at the dog. "You're not helping," she snapped, her voice breaking. Blaze tilted his head, unbothered by her outburst, and continued trailing behind them. Back inside, Julia bundled Alex in blankets and made him hot cocoa, her hands trembling as she poured the milk. She felt like she was losing control, of Alex, of the farm, of herself. Blaze had brought joy to her son, but it came at a cost. Every laugh, every smile, every moment Alex spent with the dog was a reminder of Julia's own inadequacies. She was supposed to be the one who made him happy. She was supposed to be enough. That night, as Alex slept, Julia sat on the porch with her head in her hands. Blaze was lying at her feet, his large body radiating warmth in the cold night air. She wanted to hate him, but she couldn't. Not really. He had done nothing wrong. He was just there, filling a void that Julia hadn't even realized existed. "You're not making this easy, you know," she muttered, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Blaze's ears perked up, but he didn't move. Julia sighed, leaning back against the porch railing. The stars above seemed impossibly far away, their light faint and distant. She felt just as far from everything she wanted to be, a good mother, a provider, someone who could give Alex the life he deserved. The next morning, Julia woke to find Alex in the garden with Blaze again. This time, he was standing, not in his wheelchair, not crawling, but standing on unsteady legs as he leaned against Blaze for support. Julia's breath caught in her throat as she watched from the window. Alex's face was lit up with joy, his laughter carrying through the air as Blaze stayed perfectly still, letting the boy balance against him. For a moment, Julia felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Blaze wasn't a problem to be solved. Maybe he was part of the solution. But that hope was quickly overshadowed by fear. What if Blaze hurt Alex by accident? What if one of the neighbors made good on their threats to harm the dog? What if Alex's newfound happiness was ripped away as suddenly as it had appeared? The questions haunted her as the days turned into weeks. Blaze continued to visit every day, and Alex's emotional state continued to improve. But the tension within Julia only grew. She was walking a tightrope, caught between protecting her son's fragile happiness and shielding him from the potential dangers that Blaze represented. Every time she saw Alex smiling, she felt a pang of guilt. She wanted to be happy for him, but the humiliation of her own inadequacies was impossible to ignore. Blaze had succeeded where she had failed, and no matter how much she tried to rationalize it, the thought ate away at her. As winter approached and the days grew colder, Julia knew she couldn't avoid the decision much longer. Blaze wasn't going anywhere, and neither were the doubts that filled her every waking moment. Something had to give, but Julia didn't know what, or if she'd have the strength to make the choice when the time came. Yulia sat at the kitchen table one evening, staring at a pile of unpaid bills and the growing list of repairs the farm desperately needed. The financial strain had become impossible to ignore, and the isolation of their life, while beneficial for Alex, weighed on her heavily. But as her eyes drifted to the window, she caught sight of Alex and Blaze outside in the fading light. Alex was sitting in the grass, his laughter carried on the breeze, and Blaze was lying beside him, his massive frame a comforting presence. Julia couldn't remember the last time she had seen Alex so free, so at ease in his own skin. The sight stirred something deep within her, a glimmer of an idea. For weeks, she had been haunted by her inability to give Alex what he truly needed. But what if she could turn that feeling into something meaningful? What if their farm could become more than just a sanctuary for Alex? What if it could help other children like him? The thought terrified her. The farm was already a struggle to manage, and the idea of opening it up to others felt impossibly ambitious. But the change in Alex was undeniable. If Blaze could help her son, perhaps he could help others too. Julia spent the next few nights researching programs for children with special needs, poring over articles and forums late into the night. She scribbled notes in a spiral-bound notebook, her handwriting growing messier as her excitement and fear mounted. Finally, she decided to take the leap. She began by posting a simple ad online, "Quiet Farm opening its doors to children with special needs. Experience nature and connect with animals in a peaceful, safe environment." Julia wasn't sure what kind of response to expect, or if anyone would even see the post, but she clicked publish anyway, her heart racing. To her surprise, inquiries began trickling in within days. Parents from the surrounding area reached out, desperate for opportunities for their children to connect with the world in ways that schools and traditional therapies couldn't provide. One mother wrote, "My son hasn't spoken in years, but he loves animals. I don't know if this will help, but I'll try anything." Another parent shared, "My daughter has severe anxiety, and we've never been able to find a program that works for her. I think this might be exactly what she needs." Julia's hands trembled as she read their messages. She felt unworthy of their trust. Who was she to provide these children with something meaningful? She was just a struggling single mother barely managing to keep her own life together. But when she looked out the window and saw Alex with Blaze, she knew she couldn't turn back now. The first family arrived on a chilly Saturday morning. Julia had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The driveway was bumpy and uneven, the barn needed a fresh coat of paint, and the chicken coop was missing half a door. She worried the parents would take one look at the farm and decide they'd made a mistake. The family consisted of a quiet boy named Ethan, who was around Alex's age, and his nervous mother, who hovered protectively by his side. Ethan clung to her hand, his wide eyes darting around the unfamiliar surroundings. Blaze, as if sensing the boy's anxiety, approached slowly, his massive form moving with uncharacteristic gentleness. Ethan flinched at first, but Blaze sat down at a respectful distance, tilting his head as if to say, "It's okay. I'll wait." To everyone's amazement, Ethan let go of his mother's hand and stepped toward Blaze. He knelt down, his small hands brushing over the dog's fur, and a tiny smile appeared on his face. His mother gasped, tears welling in her eyes. "He's never done that before," she whispered, her voice trembling. Word spread quickly after that. More families began arriving, each one bringing their own unique challenges and stories. There was Mia, a nonverbal girl with sensory sensitivities, who found comfort in petting the goats. There was Sam, a boy with severe ADHD, who spent hours running through the fields with Blaze at his side. And then there was Emily, a teenager with selective mutism, who surprised everyone by speaking her first words in years after a quiet afternoon in the sensory garden. Blaze became the heart of the program, his calm presence breaking through barriers that no therapist or medication had been able to reach. The other animals on the farm played their roles too. The chickens provided a gentle introduction to touch, the goats offered endless amusement, and the horses gave children a sense of empowerment as they learned to groom and care for them. But it was Blaze who seemed to understand the children on a deeper level, his quiet strength a source of comfort for even the most fearful visitors. Despite the success of the program, Julia couldn't escape the weight of her own insecurities. The parents who came to the farm often looked at her with gratitude, praising her for what she was doing, but she felt like a fraud. Every time a child made progress, she questioned whether it was truly her efforts or just the magic of Blaze. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being overshadowed by a dog. The neighbors weren't shy about voicing their opinions either. "So you're running a therapy farm now?" Mrs. Anders said one afternoon, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Must be nice to have people pay you for letting a stray dog do all the work." Julia bit her lip, the humiliation burning in her chest. She wanted to defend herself, to explain the long hours she put into planning activities and maintaining the farm, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she nodded politely and walked away, her hands trembling with anger and shame. Even her parents weren't supportive. During a strained phone call, her mother sighed loudly and said, "You can barely manage Alex, and now you're taking on other people's children? What's next, a circus?" Julia hung up before the tears could spill over. She didn't have the energy to argue. The doubts that others planted in her were already thriving in her mind. Was she making a mistake? Was she biting off more than she could chew? And worst of all, was she exploiting Blaze, using him as a crutch because she couldn't handle the responsibility on her own? But no matter how much she doubted herself, she couldn't deny the results. The children were thriving, and so was Alex. He was no longer the withdrawn boy who spent his days in silence. He laughed, he explored, and most importantly, he had a purpose. Watching him interact with the other children, showing them how to pet Blaze or draw shapes in the dirt, filled Julia with a bittersweet pride. Alex had become the bridge between the world and these children, a role she had never imagined he could fill. One evening, after the last family had left for the day, Julia sat on the porch with Alex and Blaze. The stars were beginning to appear, and the farm was quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Alex leaned against Blaze, his head resting on the dog's side, while Julia stared out at the fields. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for Alex, but for herself. Maybe she wasn't enough on her own. Maybe she never would be. But with Blaze by her side and Alex leading the way, they were creating something that mattered. Something bigger than any of them. Something worth fighting for.